Charles Bukowski was not a philosopher in the traditional sense. He never wrote academic treatises or developed systematic theories about existence. Instead, he lived his philosophy in the most brutal and honest way possible, writing it out in thousands of poems, novels and stories that emerged from decades of suffering, drinking, working dead-end jobs and watching the world with unblinking eyes. Born in Germany in 1920 and dragged to America as a child, Bukowski became what Time magazine called the laureate of American lowlife. But this label barely scratches the surface of what he really was. He was a man who refused every comfortable lie that society offered, who chose to stare directly into the void of human existence and report back what he saw there. His philosophy was not learned from books, but carved out of experience, pain, alienation, and the strange moments of beauty that sometimes emerge from the wreckage of ordinary life. What makes Bukowski's worldview so powerful is its unflinching honesty about what it means to be human in modern America. He saw through the myths of success, the lies of romantic love, the false promises of work and conformity. Yet somehow, in the midst of all this darkness, he found reasons to keep living, writing, and even laughing. This is not a philosophy for the faint of heart, but it might be the most honest guide to existence ever put to paper. Unlike other writers who philosophized from positions of comfort or academic security, Bukowski developed his ideas while living in cheap apartments, working soul-crushing jobs, and battling alcoholism. His insights about human nature came from the trenches of actual experience rather than ivory tower speculation. This gives his philosophy a weight and authenticity that purely intellectual approaches often lack. When Bukowski talks about suffering, he knows what he's talking about because he lived it for decades. When he discusses the emptiness of conventional success, he speaks as someone who chose poverty and authenticity over wealth and respectability. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski understood that philosophy is not something you think about, but something you live. Every choice he made, from what jobs he took to how he treated people to what he wrote about, reflected his deepest beliefs about how life should be lived. He didn't separate his ideas from his actions, which is why his work has such power to transform how people see the world. This is philosophy as lived experience, raw and unfiltered, without the comfortable distance that most thinkers maintain between their ideas and their lives. Part 1. Don't try, the sacred art of natural action. The two words carved into Bukowski's gravestone have confused and inspired people for decades. Don't try. At first glance, these words seem to contradict everything we know about the man who wrote them. After all, Bukowski worked relentlessly at his craft for over 50 years, producing thousands of poems and stories while holding down brutal jobs at the post office. He tried harder than almost anyone to become a writer, so what did he really mean by don't try? The answer reveals the deepest core of Bukowski's philosophy about how to live an authentic life. In letters to friends and in his writings, Bukowski explained that there are two completely different kinds of trying. The first kind is forced, desperate, effortful trying. This is when you try to want something you don't really want, try to care about things that don't matter to you, try to become someone you're not. This kind of trying is like swimming against a powerful current. It exhausts you and gets you nowhere. But there's another kind of action that Bukowski discovered through years of experience. This is what happens when something calls to you so deeply that pursuing it feels as natural as breathing. When Bukowski sat down to write, he wasn't trying to be a great writer or trying to impress anyone. He was simply allowing what was inside him to flow onto the page. The words came through him rather than from him. This is what he meant when he said that if you have to try to care about something, maybe you don't really care about it. This distinction between forced effort and natural flow became central to everything Bukowski believed about how to live. He noticed that when people chase external validation, money or status, they often become anxious, desperate, and ultimately unsuccessful. Their desperation shows, and it repels the very things they're trying to attract. But when someone follows their genuine interests and talents without attachment to outcomes, they often achieve far more than they ever imagined possible. The key is the absence of desperation, the willingness to pursue something for its own sake rather than for what it might bring you. Bukowski learned this lesson through decades of rejection and failure. In his 20s and 30s, he sent story after story to magazines and received rejection slip after rejection slip. A lesser man might have tried to figure out what editors wanted and write to please them. But Bukowski kept writing exactly what came naturally to him, even when it seemed unmarketable and offensive. He trusted that if something was authentic enough, it would eventually find its audience. And he was right. The very qualities that made his work difficult to publish initially are what make it timeless today. This philosophy extends far beyond writing into every aspect of how we choose to live. Bukowski believed that most people spend their lives trying to want the wrong things. They try to care about careers that bore them, try to maintain relationships that feel dead, try to pursue goals that society tells them they should want. Meanwhile, the things that would truly nourish their souls go ignored because they seem impractical or socially unacceptable. The result is a life of quiet desperation, where you're constantly pushing yourself to care about things that don't matter while neglecting the things that do. The genius of Don't Try is that it forces you to distinguish between authentic desire and manufactured wanting. If you have to convince yourself to pursue something, if you have to constantly motivate yourself to care about it, then you're probably chasing the wrong thing. But if the thought of not doing something hurts more than the pain of pursuing it, if giving up on it would feel like giving up on yourself, then you found something worth your time. This kind of natural pull is what Bukowski called the authentic life. It requires courage because it often means disappointing other people's expectations of what your life should look like. Bukowski also understood that Don't Try applies to how we present ourselves to the world. Most people try to be likable, try to say the right things, try to project an image of success and happiness. They craft careful personas designed to win approval and avoid criticism. But this approach is exhausting and ultimately self-defeating because it requires you to constantly monitor and adjust your behavior based on other people's reactions. Bukowski did the opposite. He showed up exactly as he was, flaws and all, without apology or explanation. This authenticity was magnetic. People were drawn to his work precisely because it felt real in a world full of pretense. There's also a deeper spiritual dimension to Don't Try that Bukowski discovered through his writing practice. When he sat down to write, especially later in his career, he found that the best work came when he got out of his own way. Instead of trying to craft clever lines or profound insights, he would simply describe what he saw, felt, or experienced with complete honesty. The power came not from his efforts to be profound, but from his willingness to be truthful. This taught him that creativity flows most freely when you stop trying to control it and simply allow it to emerge. The same principle applies to living well. Life becomes richer and more meaningful when you stop trying to force outcomes and instead focus on responding authentically to whatever arises. Don't Try is also about understanding the difference between genuine confidence and manufactured bravado. Bukowski was often seen as a tough guy, a hard-drinking rebel who didn't care what anyone thought. But those who knew him well understood that his apparent toughness came not from trying to be intimidating, but from genuinely not needing other people's approval. He had done the hard work of accepting himself, including his failures and weaknesses, which freed him from the need to prove anything to anyone. This kind of authentic confidence is unshakable because it doesn't depend on external validation. It comes from knowing who you are and being comfortable with that knowledge, even when others disapprove. The philosophy also applies to how we handle failure and setbacks. Most people try to avoid failure, or when it happens, try to pretend it doesn't affect them. Bukowski took a different approach. He acknowledged his failures openly and found ways to learn from them without becoming bitter or cynical. When his early stories were rejected, he didn't try to convince himself that it didn't matter. Instead, he felt the disappointment fully and then used that energy to fuel his next piece of writing. This honest engagement with failure made him stronger and more resilient than those who try to protect themselves from disappointment. Ultimately, Don't Try is about trusting yourself enough to follow your natural inclinations, rather than forcing yourself into molds that don't fit. It's about having the courage to disappoint people rather than living a lie. It's about understanding that the most powerful actions come not from willpower, but from alignment with your deepest nature. When you stop trying to be something you're not, you can finally become who you actually are. And that authentic self, however flawed or unconventional, is infinitely more valuable than any perfect image you could try to maintain. This is perhaps the most radical thing about Bukowski's philosophy. In a world that constantly tells us to improve ourselves, optimize our performance and strive for more, he suggests that the secret to a meaningful life might be to stop trying so hard and start trusting what comes naturally. Part 2. Suffering as the Great Teacher. Most philosophies try to help people avoid suffering or at least minimize it. Bukowski took the opposite approach. He believed that suffering was not only inevitable, but essential for developing any real understanding of what it means to be human. This wasn't masochism or depression talking. It was the hard-won wisdom of someone who had endured decades of pain and emerged with insights that comfort could never provide. Bukowski's childhood was marked by brutal beatings from his father, who would make him pull down his pants and whip him with a razor strap until his back was bloody. As a teenager, his face erupted in severe acne that left him permanently scarred and made him an object of mockery and rejection. These early experiences taught him that pain was not an aberration, but a fundamental part of existence. Rather than trying to forget or overcome these traumas, he learned to see them as his education in what life was really like beneath the pleasant surface that most people tried to maintain. What Bukowski discovered through his suffering was that pain strips away all the illusions and pretenses that normally protect us from reality. When you're in genuine agony, whether physical or emotional, you can't maintain the polite fictions that make social life possible. You see yourself and others as you really are, without the masks and roles that usually hide the truth. This brutal honesty, forced on him by circumstances beyond his control, became the foundation of his entire worldview. He learned to value this clarity more than the comfort that comes from avoiding difficult truths. He also understood that different kinds of suffering teach different lessons. Physical pain teaches you about the limitations and fragility of the body. Emotional pain teaches you about the depths of human need and the ways we can be wounded by love, betrayal, or loss. Economic suffering teaches you about power, class, and the ways society sorts people into winners and losers. Bukowski experienced all these forms of suffering and more, and each one added to his understanding of the human condition. He saw people who had been protected from suffering as fundamentally naive, like children who still believed in fairy tales. But Bukowski's philosophy of suffering goes deeper than simply enduring pain. He believed that how you respond to suffering determines whether it destroys you or makes you stronger and wiser. The key is to neither run from pain nor wallow in it, but to face it directly and learn what it has to teach you. This requires a kind of courage that most people never develop because they spend their lives trying to avoid anything unpleasant. Bukowski chose instead to lean into the pain, to examine it closely, and to find whatever truth it contained. This approach taught him that suffering often reveals things about yourself that you could never discover in comfort. When everything is going well, it's easy to maintain a positive self-image and believe that you're a good person who has life figured out. But when you're in crisis, when you're desperate or heartbroken or financially ruined, you discover what you're really made of. You learn about your capacity for selfishness, your hidden fears, your willingness to compromise your values when the stakes are high enough. These discoveries are painful but invaluable because they show you who you actually are, rather than who you like to think you are. Bukowski also noticed that people who have never really suffered often lack empathy and depth. They may be successful by conventional standards, but they tend to be shallow and judgmental because they've never been forced to confront their own vulnerabilities. In contrast, people who have been through genuine hardship often develop a compassion and understanding that can't be learned any other way. They know that everyone is struggling with something, that behind every person's public face is a private world of pain and difficulty. This knowledge makes them more tolerant of human weakness and more appreciative of small kindnesses. The writer also understood that suffering can be a source of creative power. Some of his best work came directly from his worst experiences. The pain of his childhood, the humiliation of menial jobs, the agony of failed relationships, all of these became raw material for poems and stories that resonated with millions of readers. He learned to transform his suffering into art, not by romanticizing it or making it prettier than it was, but by describing it so honestly that others recognized their own pain in his words. This gave his suffering meaning and purpose beyond its immediate unpleasantness. There's also a spiritual dimension to Bukowski's understanding of suffering. He came to see pain as a way that life strips away everything that isn't essential. When you're truly suffering, you stop caring about status, appearances, or what other people think of you. You're reduced to the basic elements of existence, to what you need to survive and what matters most to you. This reduction, though painful, can be liberating because it reveals what's truly important and what's just noise. Many of his most profound insights came from these moments when suffering had burned away everything non-essential and left him face to face with reality. Bukowski rejected the idea that suffering should be hidden or that people should pretend to be happy when they're not. He believed this kind of emotional dishonesty made everyone's pain worse by forcing people to suffer in isolation. By writing openly about his own anguish, he gave others permission to acknowledge their pain instead of pretending it didn't exist. This honesty created a sense of connection and solidarity among people who had felt alone in their suffering. He showed that pain, when faced honestly and shared openly, could become a bridge between people rather than a wall that separated them. Part 3. The War Against Meaningless Work. For most of his adult life, Bukowski fought a daily battle against the soul-crushing reality of modern work. This wasn't just a personal struggle, but a fundamental critique of how capitalist society organizes human life around the demands of profit rather than the needs of the human spirit. His novels Post Office and Factotum are not just stories about dead-end jobs, but philosophical statements about what work does to the human soul when it becomes divorced from meaning and purpose. Bukowski worked for over 10 years as a letter-filing clerk at the Los Angeles Post Office, a job that required him to sort mail for hours on end while supervisors screamed at workers to move faster. The work was physically demanding, mentally numbing, and completely dehumanizing. Workers were treated like machines, expected to perform repetitive tasks at inhuman speeds without complaint or creativity. Bukowski developed chronic back and shoulder problems from the physical demands, but the psychological damage was even worse. He watched intelligent, capable people being reduced to automatons, their spirits gradually crushed by the relentless pressure to produce more with less regard for human dignity. What horrified Bukowski most about modern work was not just the poor conditions, but the way it consumed people's entire lives. Workers spent the best hours of their days doing meaningless tasks for other people's profit, then went home exhausted and stressed, with barely enough energy left over for the things that actually mattered to them. They sacrificed their health, their relationships, their creativity and their dreams for the promise of financial security that often proved illusory anyway. Bukowski saw this as a form of voluntary slavery, where people traded their freedom and dignity for just enough money to survive and continue working. He also understood that most jobs under capitalism are fundamentally pointless. Much of the work people do serves no real human need, but exists only to generate profit for business owners or to maintain systems that benefit the wealthy. Bukowski saw through the propaganda that tried to make workers feel proud of their contribution to society. He knew that if most office jobs disappeared tomorrow, the world would actually function better, not worse. This insight led him to reject the Protestant work ethic that claimed work was inherently virtuous, regardless of what kind of work it was or what purpose it served. The writer's critique of work went beyond economics to psychology and philosophy. He believed that meaningless work damaged people's capacity for authentic living by forcing them to split themselves in two. At work they had to be obedient, conformist, and focused on external rewards rather than inner satisfaction. This conditioning carried over into the rest of their lives, making it harder for them to think independently, pursue their real interests, or develop genuine relationships. Work didn't just steal their time, it stole their ability to be themselves. They became alienated from their own desires and capabilities, losing touch with what they actually wanted from life. Bukowski contrasted this modern approach to work with more traditional forms of labour that were connected to immediate human needs. A farmer growing food, a craftsman making useful objects, or an artist creating beauty were all doing work that had intrinsic value beyond the money it generated. Such work allowed people to see the direct results of their efforts and to take pride in their contribution to human welfare. Modern corporate jobs, by contrast, often involved pushing papers around or manipulating numbers in ways that had no visible connection to anything useful or meaningful. Workers couldn't feel proud of what they did because they couldn't see how it helped anyone. His character, Henry Chernowski, became a symbol of resistance to this dehumanizing system. Rather than accepting that he had to spend his life doing work he hated, Chernowski constantly quit jobs, got fired, or simply walked away when the demands became too absurd. He preferred poverty and uncertainty to the psychological death that came from selling his time to employers who didn't value his humanity. This wasn't irresponsibility, but a form of rebellion against a system that demanded he sacrifice his soul for economic survival. Chernowski understood that keeping his inner life intact was more important than financial security. Bukowski also saw how work relationships reflected and reinforced broader power structures in society. Bosses and supervisors often became petty tyrants, drunk on their small amount of power over other people's lives. They demanded not just obedience but enthusiasm, requiring workers to pretend they enjoyed being exploited. This psychological manipulation was perhaps more damaging than the economic exploitation because it forced people to lie to themselves about their own experience. Workers had to smile while being degraded, to act grateful for jobs that made them miserable, to suppress their natural human responses to unfair treatment. The writer understood that the promise of advancement through hard work was largely a myth designed to keep people compliant. He observed that the workers who got promoted were usually not the most capable or hard-working, but the most willing to conform and please their superiors. Merit had little to do with success in most organizations. What mattered was political skill and the willingness to play along with corporate culture. This meant that the most authentic and creative people were often held back, while the most manipulative and dishonest rose to positions of power. The system rewarded the very qualities that made people less human. Bukowski's solution was not to reform the system, but to escape it as much as possible. He lived cheaply, avoided debt, and kept his needs simple so that he wouldn't be trapped by financial obligations that required him to stay in jobs he hated. When he finally became successful as a writer, he used his freedom to write honestly about what work had done to him and to the people he had known. His goal was not to become rich, but to achieve the basic dignity of supporting himself through work that had meaning and allowed him to remain true to his values. This became his model for how people might live if they had the courage to reject society's demands that they sacrifice their humanity for economic success. Part 4. Authenticity in a world of masks. Living authentically was perhaps the most challenging aspect of Bukowski's philosophy, requiring a kind of courage that most people never develop. In a society that rewards conformity and punishes difference, being genuinely yourself is a radical act that comes with serious consequences. Bukowski understood this better than most because he paid the price for his authenticity throughout his life, facing rejection, criticism and social isolation because he refused to pretend to be something he wasn't. The pressure to wear masks begins early in life. Children learn quickly that certain parts of themselves are acceptable to parents, teachers and peers, while other parts must be hidden or suppressed. By adulthood, most people have become so skilled at performing socially acceptable versions of themselves that they lose touch with who they actually are underneath all the layers of conditioning and pretense. They know how to be the good employee, the dutiful spouse, the responsible citizen, but they have no idea what their authentic desires, opinions or feelings might be. Bukowski saw this psychological split as one of the great tragedies of modern life. What made Bukowski's authenticity so powerful was that it included the parts of himself that others tried to hide. He wrote openly about his failures, his cruelty, his selfishness, his fears and his weaknesses. Most people present carefully edited versions of themselves that emphasize their positive qualities while minimizing or concealing anything that might make them look bad. Bukowski did the opposite, showing his readers the full spectrum of human nature without trying to make himself look better than he was. This complete honesty created a sense of recognition in his audience because they could see their own hidden selves reflected in his work. But authenticity for Bukowski wasn't just about emotional honesty, it was also about intellectual honesty. He refused to adopt popular opinions or fashionable ideas just because they would make him seem more enlightened or sophisticated. If he disagreed with prevailing wisdom, he said so, even when it made him unpopular with people whose approval might have advanced his career. He was willing to be seen as crude, uneducated, or politically incorrect, rather than compromise his genuine thoughts and feelings to fit in with literary or social circles. This intellectual independence was rare among writers, who often conform to the ideological expectations of their audiences. The writer also understood that authenticity requires accepting the consequences of being yourself. When you stop trying to please everyone, some people will inevitably be offended or disappointed. When you express unpopular opinions, you'll face criticism and rejection. When you refuse to play social games, you'll be excluded from certain opportunities and relationships. Bukowski experienced all of these consequences, but concluded that they were worth paying for the freedom of being genuine. He would rather have a few real relationships based on who he actually was than many superficial ones based on a false persona. Authenticity also meant being honest about his limitations and failures, rather than trying to project an image of success or wisdom. Bukowski wrote extensively about his drinking problems, his failed relationships, his financial struggles, and his personal flaws. He didn't try to present himself as someone who had figured out how to live perfectly or who had overcome all his problems. Instead, he showed readers a real human being struggling with the same difficulties they faced, making mistakes, learning slowly, and often falling short of his own ideals. This vulnerability made his insights more credible, because they came from someone who was obviously still working on himself, rather than preaching from a position of imagined superiority. The philosopher in Bukowski understood that most people's personalities are largely artificial constructions designed to win approval and avoid punishment. They learn to emphasize certain traits and suppress others based on what gets rewarded in their particular environment. Over time, these performed personalities can become so habitual that people forget they're performing at all. They mistake their social role for their true self and lose access to their deeper nature. Bukowski believed that breaking through these layers of conditioning required constant vigilance and the willingness to question everything you had been taught about who you were supposed to be. He also saw how different social contexts rewarded different kinds of authenticity. What passed for honesty in middle-class social circles was often just a more sophisticated form of performance, where people learned to share carefully selected vulnerabilities that made them seem authentic, without actually revealing anything truly compromising. Real authenticity, the kind Bukowski practiced, was much more dangerous because it included the ugly, shameful, and socially unacceptable parts of human nature. It meant admitting to thoughts and feelings that could damage your reputation or relationships if they became known. This level of honesty required a kind of fearlessness that few people possessed. Bukowski's approach to authenticity also involved accepting paradox and contradiction within himself, rather than trying to maintain a consistent image. He could be both cruel and tender, both cynical and hopeful, both selfish and generous, sometimes within the same day or even the same conversation. Rather than trying to resolve these contradictions, or hide the ones that didn't fit his image, he embraced the full complexity of human nature. This made him seem more real than people who tried to present themselves as consistently virtuous or consistently anything else. He understood that human beings are inherently contradictory and that trying to eliminate these contradictions leads to a kind of psychological death. The ultimate test of authenticity for Bukowski was whether you could be yourself when you were alone. Many people are so accustomed to performing for others that they lose the ability to simply be when no one is watching. They feel uncomfortable with silence, with their own thoughts, with the absence of external validation or distraction. Bukowski cultivated the ability to be content in his own company, to enjoy his own thoughts and feelings without needing anyone else's approval or entertainment. This self-sufficiency was the foundation of his authenticity because it meant he wasn't dependent on other people's reactions to know who he was or whether his life had value. Part 5. Love as Beautiful Catastrophe. Bukowski's philosophy of love was shaped by a lifetime of relationships that brought him both profound joy and devastating pain. Unlike romantic poets who idealized love or cynics who dismissed it entirely, Bukowski saw love as simultaneously the most beautiful and most destructive force in human experience. His understanding came not from theory, but from living through passionate affairs, bitter breakups, and the kind of deep connections that can sustain or destroy a person depending on how they end. The foundation of Bukowski's view of love was his relationship with Jane Cooney Baker, an alcoholic widow, 11 years his senior, who became the great love of his life. Jane was everything society told men not to want in a woman. She was older, heavier, poorer, and drank as much as he did. But with her, Bukowski experienced a connection that went deeper than physical attraction or social compatibility. They understood each other's pain, shared the same dark humor about life's absurdities, and found in each other a refuge from a world that had been cruel to them both. When Jane died in 1962 from complications related to alcoholism, Bukowski was devastated in a way that shaped his understanding of love for the rest of his life. From this experience, Bukowski learned that real love is not about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose imperfections complement your own. Jane and he were both damaged people, but their damage fit together in a way that made them stronger as a couple than they were individually. This taught him that the search for an ideal partner was fundamentally misguided because it was based on the fantasy that love could solve your problems, rather than simply giving you better company while you struggled with them. Real love was about accepting someone completely, including their flaws, addictions and weaknesses, and being accepted in return despite your own failings. Bukowski also understood that love often involves a fundamental contradiction. The very qualities that make someone attractive to you can become the source of conflict and pain as the relationship develops. The spontaneity and wildness that draws you to someone might make them unreliable in daily life. The intensity and passion that creates excitement might also create drama and instability. The independence and strength that you admire might make them unwilling to compromise or commit fully to the relationship. Bukowski experienced this contradiction repeatedly, finding himself attracted to women whose very attractiveness guaranteed that the relationship would eventually become problematic. He wrote extensively about how romantic relationships tend to follow a predictable pattern. In the beginning, both partners are performing idealized versions of themselves, showing their best sides while hiding their flaws and complications. This creates an intense period of discovery and excitement where everything feels magical and possible. But gradually, as the masks come off and real personalities emerge, disappointment sets in. People realize that their partner is not the fantasy they had constructed, but a real human being with the same kinds of problems and limitations that everyone has. Most relationships don't survive this transition from fantasy to reality. Bukowski's novel Women explores this dynamic through dozens of relationships that follow similar patterns. His character Henry Chernasky meets woman after woman, experiences brief periods of intense connection, then watches as the relationship deteriorates due to incompatible needs, unrealistic expectations, or simple human weakness. But rather than becoming completely cynical about love, Chernasky keeps trying because he understands that even failed relationships provide moments of genuine connection that make life worth living. The pain of loss is the price you pay for the joy of temporary intimacy. The writer also explored how love relationships often become power struggles. People use sex, affection, and emotional manipulation to try to control their partners and get their needs met. They withhold love as punishment, offer it as reward, and use the threat of withdrawal to maintain dominance in the relationship. Bukowski saw this dynamic playing out in his own relationships and in the couples around him. He understood that these power games usually destroyed whatever genuine feeling had originally existed between the partners, turning love into a kind of warfare where both sides eventually lose. But Bukowski also experienced moments in relationships when the games stopped and real intimacy became possible. These were usually brief and fragile moments when both partners let down their guards completely and saw each other without pretense or agenda. In these moments, he found the connection and understanding that made all the pain and struggle worthwhile. He learned to treasure these experiences while they lasted without expecting them to be permanent or trying to force them to continue beyond their natural lifespan. This acceptance of impermanence allowed him to enjoy love when it was available without being destroyed when it ended. Bukowski rejected the popular notion that love should make you happy. In his experience, love was more likely to make you miserable because it opened you up to vulnerability, jealousy, disappointment, and loss. But it also made you more alive, more capable of feeling deeply, more connected to your own humanity and that of others. He preferred the intensity of loving and losing to the safety of emotional numbness. This led him to keep seeking relationships, even when his track record suggested that they would probably end badly. He understood that the alternative to risking pain was accepting a kind of living death where nothing really mattered, because you had insulated yourself from caring. The philosopher in Bukowski also recognized that love reveals who you really are more clearly than any other experience. When you're in love, your usual defenses and pretenses become harder to maintain. You become jealous, possessive, irrational, and needy in ways that you might normally hide or deny. You also become capable of generosity, tenderness and sacrifice that you might not have known you possessed. Love strips away the civilized veneer and shows you your true nature, both its beauty and its ugliness. This self-knowledge, however painful, was valuable to Bukowski because it helped him understand himself and write about human nature with greater accuracy and depth. Part 6. Solitude as Sacred Space. While most people fear being alone, Bukowski discovered that solitude was not just necessary for his survival but essential for maintaining any kind of authentic existence. His relationship with solitude was complex and evolved throughout his life, but it ultimately became one of the cornerstones of his philosophy about how to live with integrity in a world that constantly pressures you to conform and perform. For Bukowski, solitude was not loneliness but a sacred space, where he could encounter himself without the distortions that other people's presence inevitably created. Bukowski learned early that he was fundamentally different from most people in ways that made social interaction exhausting and often painful. His childhood experiences of abuse and rejection taught him that other people were often sources of pain rather than comfort. As he grew older, he discovered that he had interests, values and ways of thinking that put him at odds with mainstream society. Rather than trying to change himself to fit in better, he gradually learned to embrace his outsider status and create a life that honored his need for space and independence. The writer understood that most people are terrified of being alone because they have never learned to be comfortable with themselves. They fill their lives with constant activity, noise and social interaction to avoid confronting their own thoughts and feelings. This desperate flight from solitude prevents them from developing any real self-knowledge or inner strength. They become dependent on external validation and stimulation, losing the ability to generate their own sense of meaning and purpose. Bukowski saw this dependency as a form of psychological slavery that made people easy to manipulate and control. For Bukowski, solitude was where his real life happened. It was in solitude that he did his writing, his thinking, his reading, and his deepest feeling. Social interactions, while sometimes necessary and occasionally pleasurable, were mostly performances that required him to present simplified versions of himself that others could understand and accept. Only when he was alone could he be completely himself, with all his contradictions, complexities, and authentic responses to experience. This made solitude not just pleasant, but essential for maintaining his sense of identity and integrity. The practical benefits of solitude extended beyond psychological comfort to creative productivity. Bukowski discovered that his best writing came when he had been alone long enough to settle into his natural rhythms and thought patterns. Social interaction, even when positive, disrupted this inner state and made it harder for him to access the deeper levels of consciousness where creativity emerged. He needed extended periods of silence and isolation to process his experiences and transform them into art. This taught him to protect his solitude fiercely, even when it meant disappointing people who wanted more of his time and attention. Bukowski also understood that solitude revealed the difference between wanting to be with someone and needing to be with someone. When you're comfortable alone, you can choose relationships based on genuine affection and compatibility rather than desperation or fear of loneliness. This makes your connections with others stronger and more authentic because they're not contaminated by neediness or the desire to escape yourself. People who can't stand to be alone often end up in relationships for the wrong reasons. staying with partners who don't suit them simply because being with the wrong person feels better than being with themselves. The writer learned to distinguish between productive solitude and destructive isolation. Productive solitude was chosen and purposeful, used for reflection, creativity, or simply enjoying your own company. Destructive isolation was usually driven by fear, anger, or depression, and led to stagnation rather than growth. Bukowski experienced both types throughout his life, but gradually learned to cultivate the former while avoiding the latter. This required developing the ability to be alone without becoming bitter, paranoid, or completely cut off from human contact. Solitude also taught Bukowski about the difference between being lonely and being alone. Loneliness was a feeling of disconnection and emptiness that could occur even when surrounded by people. Being alone was simply a physical state that could be filled with richness, peace, and satisfaction if you knew how to inhabit it properly. He discovered that some of his happiest and most fulfilling moments came when he was completely alone, reading a good book, writing, or simply observing the world around him without any need to share or explain the experience to anyone else. The philosopher in Bukowski recognized that solitude was essential for developing any kind of independent thinking. When you're constantly surrounded by other people's opinions, expectations, and emotional reactions, it becomes difficult to know what you actually think or feel about anything. Social pressure, even when subtle and well-intentioned, shapes your responses and makes it hard to develop authentic positions on important questions. Only in solitude could he think through issues completely, free from the need to consider how his conclusions might affect his relationships or social standing. This intellectual independence was crucial for his development as both a writer and a human being. Bukowski also discovered that solitude was where he could most directly encounter the larger mysteries of existence. When the noise and distraction of social life quieted down, he became more aware of fundamental questions about meaning, mortality, and the nature of reality. These encounters with the unknown and unknowable were sometimes frightening, but also profound and transformative. They reminded him that individual human dramas, however intense they might feel, were part of a much larger cosmic story that put everything in perspective. This cosmic perspective, available mainly in solitude, helped him maintain his sanity and sense of humor even during the most difficult periods of his life. Part 7. The Hollowness of Success and the American Dream. Bukowski lived through the era when America promised its citizens that hard work, conformity, and positive thinking would lead to prosperity and happiness. He had a front-row seat to observe how this promise played out in real life, and what he saw convinced him that the American dream was not just false, but actively destructive to human well-being. His critique went beyond economics to psychology and philosophy, revealing how the pursuit of conventional success corrupted people's souls and made genuine satisfaction impossible. The writer understood that the American dream was built on several fundamental lies about human nature and what makes life worth living. The first lie was that happiness could be purchased through material accumulation. Bukowski observed that people who achieved financial success often became more anxious and dissatisfied rather than less, because they discovered that money couldn't solve the deeper problems of meaning and connection that plagued human existence. The second lie was that social status and recognition would provide lasting satisfaction. He watched successful people become trapped by their own reputations, forced to maintain personas that bore little resemblance to who they actually were. The third lie was that competition and individual achievement were natural human drives that led to fulfillment when properly channeled. From his own experience of eventually achieving literary success, Bukowski learned firsthand how hollow conventional achievement could be. When his books began selling well and critics started taking him seriously, he found that success brought its own set of problems and limitations. People wanted him to repeat what had made him famous, rather than continuing to grow and evolve as an artist. They expected him to be grateful and humble about his good fortune, even though he knew that luck had played as large a role as talent in his recognition. Success also attracted people who were interested in his fame rather than his actual work or personality, making it harder to form genuine relationships. Bukowski observed how the pursuit of success changed people in ways they didn't always recognize. To achieve conventional goals, people had to learn to suppress parts of themselves that might interfere with their advancement. They became more calculating, more concerned with appearances, more willing to compromise their values for strategic advantage. Over time, these compromises accumulated until they had lost touch with whatever authentic desires and interests had originally motivated them. They achieved their goals, but discovered that they were no longer the same people who had set those goals in the first place. The success belonged to someone they had become rather than someone they actually were. The writer also saw how the promise of future success was used to justify present misery. People endured jobs they hated, relationships that didn't fulfill them, and lifestyles that felt empty because they believed that their current sacrifices would eventually pay off in greater happiness. This deferred gratification mentality meant that many people spent their entire lives waiting for their real life to begin, always working towards some future state where they would finally be able to relax and enjoy themselves. But when that future arrived, if it arrived at all, they often found that they had lost the ability to enjoy simple pleasures, or that their idea of happiness had been shaped by advertising and social pressure rather than their own authentic desires. Bukowski contrasted the artificial goals promoted by consumer culture with the simpler satisfactions that he had discovered through his own experience. Reading a good book, writing something honest, having a genuine conversation, watching the sunset, or simply being comfortable in your own skin required no money, status, or external validation. These experiences were available to anyone willing to slow down and pay attention to what was actually happening in their life, rather than constantly striving for something better. But the culture of success made people feel that such simple pleasures were somehow inadequate, or that enjoying them represented a lack of ambition. The philosophy of success also created artificial scarcity by teaching people that worth was relative rather than absolute. Instead of being satisfied with having enough, people were encouraged to compare themselves constantly with others and to feel inadequate whenever someone else had more. This comparative mindset made satisfaction impossible because there would always be someone wealthier, more famous, or more accomplished to envy. Bukowski rejected this competitive approach to life, choosing instead to focus on whether his own needs were being met rather than how he measured against others. This allowed him to find contentment with relatively little material wealth, while people with much more remained chronically dissatisfied. The writer understood that the American dream was particularly destructive because it promised that anyone could achieve success through individual effort while ignoring the systemic inequalities that made success impossible for many people. This created a cruel form of victim blaming, where people who didn't achieve prosperity were told that they simply hadn't worked hard enough or wanted it badly enough. Bukowski saw through this mythology because his own life experience had shown him how much success depended on factors beyond individual control, like luck, timing, family background, and simple genetics. He understood that the success mythology served the interests of those who were already wealthy and powerful by making inequality seem natural and justified. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski recognized that the pursuit of conventional success often required people to become the kinds of people they had originally hoped success would allow them to avoid being. To get ahead in competitive environments, you had to become manipulative, dishonest, and willing to use others for your own advantage. You had to care more about winning than about fairness, more about profit than about human welfare, more about appearance than about substance. The very qualities that led to external success were often incompatible with internal peace and genuine human connection. This meant that achieving the American dream often required abandoning the dreams that had originally made life seem worth living. Part 8. Death as the ultimate truth-teller. Death was never an abstract concept for Bukowski, but a constant presence that shaped how he understood life and what made it worth living. His awareness of mortality was sharpened by his own health problems, the deaths of people he loved, and his observation of how the fact of death exposed the pretenses and illusions that people used to avoid confronting reality. Rather than trying to deny or avoid thinking about death, Bukowski used his awareness of life's brevity to clarify what mattered and what didn't. Bukowski's relationship with death began early, with the loss of his beloved Jane Cooney Baker in 1962. Jane's death from complications related to alcoholism devastated him, but also taught him that love and loss were inseparable parts of the same experience. Her death forced him to confront the fact that everything he cared about was temporary, and that this temporariness, rather than making things meaningless, actually made them more precious. He learned to love more fully because he understood that time was limited and that opportunities for connection would not last forever. The writer also used his awareness of mortality to cut through social pretenses and artificial concerns. When you truly understand that you will die, many of the things that seem important in daily life reveal themselves as trivial distractions. Social status, material possessions, others' opinions, and even many personal achievements become less compelling when measured against the ultimate reality of death. This perspective allowed Bukowski to focus on what he considered the essential elements of a meaningful life: authentic relationships, creative expression, and direct experience of beauty and truth. Everything else was just noise. Bukowski observed how differently people responded to the awareness of their own mortality. Some became paralyzed by fear and spent their lives trying to accumulate enough wealth, power, or fame to feel secure against death's inevitability. Others threw themselves into frantic activity, trying to accomplish as much as possible before time ran out. Still others retreated into denial, living as if death would never come to them personally. Bukowski chose a different approach, accepting death as natural and using that acceptance to live more freely and authentically. If you were going to die anyway, why spend your limited time trying to please people you didn't respect or pursuing goals that didn't genuinely matter to you? His own health crises, including a near-fatal bleeding ulcer in his 40s, gave him direct experience of how proximity to death could clarify priorities. During his recovery, he realized that many of the things he had been worrying about were completely insignificant compared to the simple fact of being alive. This experience convinced him to quit his job at the post office and commit himself fully to writing, even though it meant accepting financial insecurity. He understood that the risk of poverty was nothing compared to the certainty of wasting whatever time he had left on work that destroyed his spirit. Bukowski also wrote extensively about how the inevitability of death made certain kinds of suffering seem absurd. People tortured themselves over embarrassments, failures, and disappointments that would be completely forgotten within a few years. They held grudges, nursed resentments, and allowed pride to prevent them from reconciling with people they loved. From the perspective of someone who understood that everyone involved would eventually be dead, these conflicts seemed like a tremendous waste of the small amount of time available for genuine connection and joy. This cosmic perspective helped him forgive others and himself more easily and focus on what could still be repaired or enjoyed. The writer found that contemplating death also enhanced his appreciation for simple pleasures. A good meal, a beautiful sunset, a moment of laughter, or a well-written sentence became more vivid and meaningful when experienced with the knowledge that such experiences were finite. This wasn't morbid but life-affirming, because it prevented him from taking good things for granted or assuming they would always be available. He learned to be present for positive experiences instead of rushing through them towards some imagined future satisfaction. Bukowski rejected both the religious promise of afterlife and the secular fantasy of symbolic immortality through achievement or legacy. He didn't believe that death was a transition to something better, nor did he imagine that his work would make him immortal in any meaningful sense. This stark acceptance of finitude forced him to find meaning in life itself, rather than in any imagined continuation beyond death. If this life was all there was, then it had to be enough, and finding ways to make it enough became his central challenge. This led him to invest more fully in present experience rather than sacrificing the present for an uncertain future. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski understood that accepting the reality of death was liberating because it freed him from many of the fears that controlled other people's lives. When you truly accept that you will die, the fear of social rejection, financial failure, or personal embarrassment loses much of its power. These things might be unpleasant, but they couldn't kill you. And since death was coming anyway, there seemed little point in organizing your entire life around avoiding lesser discomforts. This liberation from fear allowed him to take risks, speak honestly, and live according to his own values rather than society's expectations. Death paradoxically taught him how to live. Part 9. The Religion of Raw Experience. For Bukowski, direct experience was the only reliable source of truth and wisdom. He distrusted abstract theories, second-hand knowledge, and received wisdom that hadn't been tested against the reality of actual living. This led him to develop what could be called a religion of raw experience, where truth was discovered not through study or contemplation, but through direct encounter with the full spectrum of human existence, including its most painful and degrading aspects. This philosophy emerged from Bukowski's observation that most people lived their lives at several removes from reality. They experienced the world through the filter of other people's opinions, cultural conditioning, and abstract concepts that distorted their perception of what was actually happening. They knew what they were supposed to think about love, work, success, and meaning, but they had little direct knowledge of these things as they actually existed, rather than as they were described in books, movies, or social conversations. Bukowski chose instead to base his understanding on what he had personally witnessed, felt, and endured. The writer's commitment to raw experience meant that he was willing to expose himself to situations that most people avoided. He spent time in the company of alcoholics, criminals, prostitutes, and other social outcasts, not because he romanticized their lives, but because he wanted to understand the full range of human possibility. He worked degrading jobs, lived in poverty, and subjected himself to relationships that were often destructive because he believed that comfort and security, while pleasant, didn't teach you much about what human beings were really like under pressure. Pain, failure, and humiliation were better teachers than success and happiness because they stripped away pretenses and revealed the truth about yourself and others. This approach also applied to his writing practice. Rather than trying to craft beautiful or uplifting prose, Bukowski wrote about whatever he was actually experiencing, thinking, and feeling, regardless of whether it would make him look good or advance any particular message. He described hangovers, failures, petty cruelties, sexual encounters, and moments of despair with the same attention he gave to occasional experiences of beauty or transcendence. This commitment to honesty over artistry created a body of work that felt more true to actual human experience than the carefully constructed narratives that most writers produced. Bukowski understood that raw experience often contradicted popular beliefs about how life worked. People were taught that virtue was rewarded, that hard work led to success, that love conquered all, and that justice ultimately prevailed. But his direct observation showed him that life was much more random and unfair than these comforting stories suggested. Good people often suffered while bad people prospered. Talented individuals remained unrecognized while mediocre ones achieved fame, and love often led to misery rather than happiness. Rather than trying to reconcile these contradictions with conventional wisdom, he simply reported what he saw and let readers draw their own conclusions. The religion of raw experience also meant that Bukowski was constantly updating his beliefs based on new information rather than clinging to positions that no longer seemed accurate. He was willing to admit when he had been wrong about something and to change his mind when his experience taught him something new. This intellectual flexibility was rare among writers, who often became attached to particular ideas or images and continued promoting them long after they had ceased to believe in them personally. Bukowski's commitment to truth over consistency made his work feel alive and dynamic rather than static and dogmatic. This approach extended to his understanding of himself. Rather than maintaining a fixed self-image or trying to develop in particular directions, he allowed his personality and beliefs to evolve in response to whatever life presented to him. He observed his own reactions, contradictions, and changes with the same detached interest he brought to observing others. This self-knowledge, gained through honest self-observation rather than self-improvement techniques, gave him unusual insight into human nature and made his writing more psychologically accurate than that of authors who tried to present idealized versions of themselves. Bukowski also recognized that raw experience included both the physical and emotional dimensions of life. He paid attention to his body, to sensations of hunger, fatigue, arousal, and pain, understanding that physical experience was just as important as mental or emotional experience in shaping who you were and how you understood the world. This embodied approach to knowledge put him at odds with more intellectual writers who tended to treat the body as secondary to the mind. For Bukowski, the body was a source of information about reality that couldn't be obtained any other way. Hunger taught you about need, pain taught you about limitation, And physical pleasure taught you about the possibility of joy in ways that abstract thinking never could. The writer understood that committing to raw experience required giving up many of the comforts and illusions that made life easier to bear. It meant accepting that you might discover things about yourself and the world that you would rather not know. It meant being willing to have your beliefs challenged and your hopes disappointed in service of a more accurate understanding of how things actually worked. Most people weren't willing to pay this price, preferring comforting fantasies to difficult truths. But Bukowski believed that this trade-off was worth making because it led to a more authentic and ultimately more satisfying way of living, even if that satisfaction came mixed with considerable pain and disillusionment. Part 10. Anti-Intellectualism and the Wisdom of the Streets. Bukowski maintained a lifelong suspicion of formal education and intellectual pretension, not because he was anti-learning, but because he believed that real wisdom came from living rather than from studying what other people had written about living. This put him at odds with the literary establishment, which valued academic credentials and theoretical sophistication over the kind of street-level understanding that Bukowski had developed through decades of direct experience with poverty, failure, and social rejection. His anti-intellectualism was not ignorance, but a conscious choice to trust his own observations over received wisdom. The writer understood that formal education often served to disconnect people from their own authentic responses to experience. Students learned to see the world through the lens of established theories and approved interpretations rather than developing their own capacity for observation and judgment. They became skilled at analyzing and categorizing experience, but lost the ability to simply encounter it directly without immediately fitting it into pre-existing frameworks. This created a kind of psychological distance between educated people and their own lives that Bukowski found both tragic and absurd. They knew what experts said about love, death, work and meaning, but they had little personal knowledge of these things as lived realities. Bukowski's own education came from working alongside people who had been failed by society's institutions. At the post office, in bars, at the racetrack, and in cheap apartments, he encountered individuals whose intelligence and insight had never been recognized by schools or employers, but who possessed deep understanding of human nature and survival. These people had been forced to develop practical wisdom because their lives depended on accurately reading situations and people rather than on impressing teachers or advancing through institutional hierarchies. Their knowledge was harder won and more reliable than what could be learned from books because it had been tested against the harsh realities of actual experience. The writer also observed how intellectual sophistication often served as a form of emotional armor that protected people from having to feel the full impact of difficult experiences. They could analyze their problems, theorize about their relationships, and contextualize their suffering in abstract terms that kept them at a safe distance from the raw emotional content of their lives. This intellectual defense mechanism prevented them from learning what their pain had to teach them and from developing the emotional resilience that comes only from facing difficult feelings directly. Bukowski preferred the emotional honesty of people who lacked the vocabulary to intellectualize their experience and therefore had to confront it more directly. Bukowski's anti-intellectualism also extended to his critique of how academic analysis often drained the life out of art and literature. He watched scholars dissect works of art with surgical precision, explaining their historical context, symbolic meaning, and technical innovations, while completely missing the emotional impact that had made them worth creating in the first place. This analytical approach treated art as a puzzle to be solved, rather than as a direct communication from one human consciousness to another. It valued interpretation over experience and understanding over feeling, creating a barrier between readers and the living truth that great art was meant to convey. Bukowski wrote to reach people's hearts and guts, not their analytical minds. The writer understood that intellectual pride often prevented people from learning from sources that seemed beneath their educational level. Educated individuals dismissed the insights of bartenders, factory workers, and street people because these sources lacked proper credentials, even when their observations about human nature were more accurate than what could be found in academic journals. This intellectual snobbery blinded supposedly smart people to wisdom that was available all around them and limited their understanding to what had been approved by institutional authorities. Bukowski remained open to learning from anyone whose experience had taught them something genuine about how life actually worked. His anti-intellectualism was also a reaction against the way abstract thinking could be used to justify cruelty and inhumanity. He observed how politicians, economists, and social planners could discuss policies that devastated real people's lives as if they were chess moves in some grand theoretical game. Their distance from the human consequences of their ideas allowed them to pursue strategies that sounded reasonable in theory, but caused immense suffering in practice. Bukowski's commitment to concrete experience made him deeply suspicious of any approach to human problems that didn't take into account the actual feelings and needs of the people involved. Theory without empathy was not just useless but dangerous. The writer also recognized that intellectual sophistication often served as a substitute for genuine self-knowledge and personal growth. People could spend years studying psychology, philosophy, and literature without ever seriously examining their own motivations, fears, and patterns of behavior. They became experts on human nature in the abstract while remaining strangers to themselves. This allowed them to feel superior to others while avoiding the difficult work of actually changing or improving their own lives. Bukowski preferred the honest ignorance of people who admitted they didn't understand themselves to the false knowledge of those who had convinced themselves that studying others gave them insight into their own nature. But Bukowski's anti-intellectualism was not complete rejection of learning or thinking. He was widely read and deeply influenced by writers like Dostoevsky, Hemingway and Henry Miller, whose work combined intellectual depth with emotional authenticity. What he rejected was the academic approach that separated thinking from feeling and knowledge from experience. He valued ideas that emerged from lived experience and could be applied to the challenges of actual existence. His ideal was the kind of wisdom that helped people live better, rather than the kind that impressed other intellectuals with its cleverness or complexity. Intelligence was valuable only when it served life, not when it became an end in itself or a way of avoiding the messy realities of human existence. Part 11. The Futility of Trying to Save Others. One of the hardest lessons Bukowski learned was that you cannot save other people from themselves, no matter how much you love them or how clearly you can see what they need to do differently. This understanding came from watching people he cared about destroy themselves through addiction, bad choices, and self-defeating patterns, while his efforts to help them only seemed to make things worse. The lesson was particularly painful because it meant accepting that love and good intentions were not enough to prevent the people you cared about from causing themselves tremendous suffering. Bukowski's relationship with Jane Cooney Baker provided the clearest example of this dynamic. He loved Jane deeply and could see that her drinking was killing her, but his attempts to get her to moderate her alcohol consumption only led to conflict and resentment. She would promise to cut back, then drink even more heavily than before, often in secret to avoid his disapproval. He gradually realized that his concern, however well-intentioned, was experienced by Jane as criticism and control rather than love. The more he tried to save her, the more she pulled away from him and deeper into the very behavior he was trying to prevent. This taught him that the desire to rescue someone, even from obvious self-destruction, could become another form of aggression. The writer observed this pattern repeating itself in many relationships and contexts. Parents tried to save their children from making mistakes and ended up alienating them through excessive control and criticism. Friends tried to save friends from bad relationships or poor decisions and found themselves cut off from people they were trying to help. Social workers and therapists tried to save clients who weren't ready or willing to be saved and burned out from the futility of their efforts. In each case, the would-be rescuers' need to help often said more about their own psychology than about the actual needs of the person they were trying to save. Bukowski came to understand that the impulse to save others often stemmed from your own discomfort with witnessing suffering rather than from genuine compassion. Watching someone you care about make destructive choices creates anxiety and helplessness that can be temporarily relieved by taking action, even when that action is unwelcome or ineffective. The rescuer gets to feel useful and virtuous, while avoiding the more difficult task of simply being present with someone else's pain without trying to fix it. This dynamic turned helping into a selfish act disguised as generosity, where the helper's need to feel important and effective took precedence over what the other person actually wanted or needed. The writer also learned that many people were more invested in their problems than in solving them. Their struggles gave them identity, attention, and a sense of drama that they would unconsciously resist giving up, even when solutions were available. Addiction, dysfunctional relationships, financial chaos, and other forms of self-sabotage often served psychological functions that the person wasn't ready to replace with healthier alternatives. Until someone was genuinely ready to change, all the advice, support, and resources in the world would be useless or even counterproductive. This readiness couldn't be forced or created by external pressure. It had to emerge from within the person when they had suffered enough to genuinely want something different. Bukowski discovered that accepting your inability to save others was actually more loving than continuing to try. When you stopped trying to fix someone, you could simply be with them as they were rather than constantly communicating disappointment that they weren't who you thought they should be. This acceptance allowed for more genuine intimacy because the other person didn't have to defend themselves against your improvement agenda. They could share their struggles without fearing judgment or unwanted advice, which often made them more likely to eventually seek help when they were ready. Paradoxically, giving up your efforts to change someone sometimes created the space for them to change themselves. This philosophy extended beyond personal relationships to Bukowski's view of social and political change. He was deeply aware of injustice and suffering in society, but skeptical of most organized efforts to reform or improve things. He observed that social movements often attracted people who were more interested in feeling righteous than in actually helping those they claimed to serve. The complexity of social problems usually defeated well-intentioned reforms, which often created new problems while failing to solve the original ones. This didn't make him indifferent to suffering, but realistic about what individual action could accomplish against systemic issues. The writer's acceptance of human limitation also applied to his view of his own writing and its potential impact. He wrote honestly about his experiences and observations, but didn't expect his work to change or improve anyone who read it. If his books helped some readers feel less alone or gave them permission to be more honest about their own lives, that was a bonus rather than his primary motivation. He wrote primarily because he needed to write, not because he believed literature could save the world or transform human nature. This lack of missionary zeal kept his work free from the preachiness that characterized many writers who saw themselves as teachers or reformers. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski learned that the best way to help others was often to focus on your own growth and authenticity, rather than on trying to fix them. When you lived honestly and took responsibility for your own life, you provided an example that others could follow if they chose to. This indirect influence was often more powerful than direct attempts at persuasion, because it demonstrated rather than argued for a different way of being. People were more likely to be inspired by someone who had actually done the difficult work of changing themselves than by someone who specialized in telling others how they should change. The most profound help you could offer was simply being yourself and letting others see what authentic living looked like in practice. Part 12. Aging and the Evolution of Understanding. Bukowski's relationship with aging was complex and evolved dramatically throughout his life, from the angry young man who saw growing older as defeat to the mature writer who found unexpected wisdom and even peace in his later years. His changing perspective on age provided one of the most interesting aspects of his philosophy, showing how experience could transform not just what you knew, but how you approached the entire business of being alive. Unlike many writers who peaked early and spent their later years repeating themselves, Bukowski continued to grow and change well into his 70s. In his youth, Bukowski saw age as the enemy of everything that made life worth living. He equated getting older with compromise, conformity, and the gradual death of dreams and passion. Young Bukowski despised the middle-aged people he saw around him, viewing them as cautious, boring, and spiritually dead. He was determined never to become like them, even if it meant dying young rather than living long enough to lose his edge and authenticity. This attitude led him to take enormous risks with his health and safety, drinking heavily and living recklessly, as if he were racing against time to experience everything before age could dull his senses. But as Bukowski actually aged, he discovered that many of his assumptions about what growing older meant were wrong. Rather than losing his capacity for intense experience, he found that age brought a different kind of depth and appreciation that youth couldn't access. The desperate urgency of his younger years gradually gave way to a more relaxed and contemplative approach to life. He learned to enjoy simple pleasures that he had previously dismissed as boring or inadequate. A quiet evening at home, a good meal, or a conversation with his wife, Linda Lee, became more satisfying than the wild adventures he had pursued in his 20s and 30s. Aging also brought Bukowski a kind of freedom that younger people rarely experience. As he became less physically attractive and sexually compelling, he was freed from many of the games and performances that had complicated his relationships when he was younger. Women who were interested in him now were more likely to be attracted to his mind and personality rather than looking for excitement or adventure. This allowed for more genuine connections based on compatibility and mutual respect rather than passion and drama. He discovered that there was something liberating about being past the age where you had to prove your desirability or compete for romantic attention. The writer found that age also brought perspective on the struggles and obsessions that had dominated his earlier years. Problems that had seemed enormous and urgent when he was younger revealed themselves as temporary phases that had passed naturally without requiring heroic solutions. This historical perspective on his own life made him more patient with current difficulties and more confident that they too would eventually resolve themselves one way or another. He learned to distinguish between problems that required immediate action and those that would work themselves out given enough time. This patience was perhaps the greatest gift that aging brought him. Bukowski also discovered that his writing improved as he aged, despite common assumptions that creativity peaked in youth. His later work had a depth and emotional sophistication that his earlier writing, however energetic and original, had lacked. Decades of experience had given him more material to draw from and better understanding of human nature in all its complexity. He could write about subjects like love, loss, and mortality with authority that came only from having lived through these experiences multiple times. His prose became more economical and precise as he learned to say more with fewer words, cutting away the verbal excess that had sometimes characterized his younger work. The physical limitations that came with aging taught Bukowski important lessons about adaptation and acceptance. As his body became less reliable and his energy decreased, he was forced to become more selective about how he spent his time and attention. This selectivity actually improved his life because it required him to focus on what mattered most and eliminate activities and relationships that weren't truly important to him. He learned to say no to social obligations, professional opportunities, and personal demands that would have been difficult to refuse when he was younger and more concerned with pleasing others. Physical limitations became a tool for establishing better boundaries and priorities. Aging also changed Bukowski's relationship with death from abstract fear to concrete acceptance. As friends and contemporaries began dying and his own health problems multiplied, death became a real presence rather than a distant possibility. This proximity to mortality clarified his thinking about what he wanted to accomplish with whatever time remained, and freed him from long-term worries that had previously caused him anxiety. If you might die within the next few years, it became pointless to worry about problems that would take decades to develop or goals that required extensive future planning. This focus on the immediate present made his remaining time more vivid and meaningful. Perhaps most surprisingly, Bukowski found that aging brought him a kind of peace that had eluded him throughout most of his life. The anger and restlessness that had driven his earlier work gradually mellowed into something more like acceptance and even contentment. He stopped fighting so hard against the limitations and injustices of existence and learned to find satisfaction within whatever circumstances life presented. This wasn't resignation or defeat, but a mature recognition that some battles weren't worth fighting, and that happiness often came from working with reality rather than against it. The old man Bukowski was calmer and wiser than the young rebel, though he retained enough edge to keep his writing honest and compelling. The writer's experience of aging also taught him to appreciate the different phases of life, rather than viewing them as steps toward decay. Youth had its own gifts of energy and possibility, but age had different gifts of wisdom and perspective that were equally valuable. Rather than mourning what he had lost, He learned to value what he had gained through the process of living long enough to accumulate genuine experience and understanding. This appreciation for the full arc of human development made him more compassionate toward people of all ages and more able to find meaning in whatever stage of life he was currently experiencing. Part 13. Art as Survival Mechanism. For Bukowski, writing was never a career choice or artistic ambition, but a survival mechanism as essential as food, shelter, or oxygen. Without the ability to transform his experiences into words, he believed he would have gone insane or killed himself long before achieving any recognition or success. This understanding of art as psychological necessity, rather than cultural luxury, shaped everything about how he approached his work and what he expected it to accomplish in his life and the lives of others. The writer discovered early that putting his experiences into words helped him process and survive events that might otherwise have overwhelmed him. The beatings from his father, the rejection from peers, the humiliation of menial jobs, and the pain of failed relationships all became more bearable when he could describe them accurately and honestly. Writing wasn't therapy in any conventional sense because Bukowski wasn't trying to heal or improve himself through the process. Instead, he was trying to transform raw experience into something that could be examined, understood, and shared with others who might be going through similar struggles. The act of writing gave shape and meaning to experiences that had seemed random and meaningless when they were simply happening to him. Bukowski understood that art could serve as a bridge between isolation and connection. Through his writing, he could communicate with readers who had similar experiences or feelings without having to engage in the compromises and performances that face-to-face relationships often required. His books became a way of saying things that were too honest or complex for ordinary conversation. Readers could encounter his thoughts and experiences in private without having to respond immediately or manage his reactions to their responses. This created a form of intimacy that was both safer and more authentic than most personal relationships, because it was based purely on the exchange of honest communication without the complications of ongoing social interaction. The writer also saw art as a way of preserving experiences that would otherwise be lost or forgotten. The lives of poor people, social outcasts, and ordinary working individuals rarely made it into literature or historical records. Their struggles, insights, and moments of beauty disappeared when they died because no one considered their experiences worthy of permanent record. Bukowski saw his writing as a form of witness-bearing, documenting a way of life, and a perspective that mainstream culture typically ignored or dismissed. He was creating an archive of experiences that might help future readers understand what it was actually like to live at the bottom of American society during the mid-20th century. Art also functioned for Bukowski as a way of asserting his own existence and worth in a world that often treated him as invisible or expendable. When society told him that his thoughts and experiences didn't matter because he lacked education, money, or social status, his writing became a way of insisting that his consciousness was as valuable and interesting as anyone else's. Each poem or story was an act of rebellion against the forces that tried to erase or diminish him. By transforming his life into art, he elevated experiences that others might consider worthless into something that could potentially outlast his physical existence. This wasn't grandiosity, but a basic assertion of human dignity through creative expression. The survival function of art extended beyond Bukowski's personal psychological needs to his economic circumstances. Writing eventually became his way of earning a living without having to submit to the soul-crushing demands of conventional employment. This economic independence was crucial to his survival because he had proven incapable of succeeding within normal workplace hierarchies. His personality, values and need for autonomy made him unemployable in any traditional sense, so art became literally his means of survival rather than just a hobby or side interest. The urgency this created in his work gave it an energy and authenticity that might have been missing if writing had been simply one option among many. Bukowski also understood that art could serve as a survival mechanism for his readers as well as for himself. He received thousands of letters from people who told him that his books had helped them feel less alone, given them permission to be honest about their own struggles, or simply provided entertainment during difficult periods. This wasn't because his work was uplifting or inspirational in any conventional sense, but because it showed readers that someone else had experienced similar pain and confusion, and had found ways to continue living despite it. His survival became proof that their survival was possible even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Art created a form of solidarity among people who might never meet, but who shared common experiences of alienation and struggle. The writer rejected the romantic notion that art required suffering, but he understood that it often emerged from the need to make sense of difficult experiences. People who were comfortable and satisfied with their lives rarely felt compelled to create anything, because they had no pressing need to transform or transcend their circumstances. Art often came from the gap between how things were and how they might be, from the dissatisfaction and longing that drove people to imagine alternatives to their current reality. This didn't mean that artists should seek out suffering, but it helped explain why so many great works of art came from people who had experienced significant hardship or displacement. Bukowski's approach to art as survival also meant that he never took his ability to write for granted. He understood that creativity was fragile and could be destroyed by the wrong circumstances, attitudes, or pressures. This made him protective of his writing process and suspicious of anything that might interfere with his ability to continue producing work. He avoided literary scenes, academic positions, and other opportunities that might have advanced his career but could have compromised his authenticity or creative freedom. He understood that for him, maintaining the ability to write honestly was more important than achieving conventional success as a writer. Art was too essential to his survival to risk corrupting it for external rewards. Part 14. Finding comedy in the cosmic joke. Despite the darkness and despair that permeated much of his work, Bukowski possessed a profound sense of humour about the absurdity of human existence. He understood that the same events that could drive you to tears could also make you laugh, depending on how you chose to frame them. This ability to find comedy in tragedy was not defensive or bitter, but came from a deep appreciation for the ridiculous gap between human pretensions and human reality. His humour became one of his most important tools for survival, and one of the qualities that made his darkest observations bearable for readers. Bukowski's comedy often focused on the absurd lengths people went to in order to maintain their dignity and self-importance in situations that were inherently undignified. He wrote hilarious descriptions of his own attempts to appear sophisticated or competent when he was clearly out of his depth. His willingness to laugh at himself and his own pretensions gave him permission to laugh at others without malice. The humour came not from superior judgment, but from recognition of shared human foolishness. Everyone was stumbling through life with incomplete information and inflated self-regard, which made the human comedy universal rather than personal. The writer found particular amusement in the gap between how institutions presented themselves and how they actually functioned. The post office claimed to deliver mail efficiently, but Bukowski's experience working there revealed it as a chaos of incompetence, petty tyranny, and bureaucratic absurdity. Universities pretended to be centres of learning and wisdom, but he observed them as places where mediocre minds accumulated credentials while avoiding any genuine encounter with ideas or reality. This institutional hypocrisy wasn't malicious, but simply reflected the human tendency to create elaborate justifications for whatever they happened to be doing anyway. The comedy lay in how seriously people took these obviously flawed systems. Bukowski also found humour in the predictable patterns of human behaviour, especially in romantic relationships. People convinced themselves that each new relationship would be different from their previous disasters, then proceeded to repeat exactly the same mistakes with different partners. They fell in love with projections and fantasies, ignored obvious warning signs, and expressed shock when reality failed to match their expectations. The comedy wasn't cruel because Bukowski included himself among these hopeless romantics who never seemed to learn from experience. The repetitive nature of human folly became a source of amusement rather than despair because it revealed something endearingly persistent about the human spirit. The cosmic joke, as Bukowski understood it, was that existence itself seemed designed to frustrate human desires and expectations. People wanted security in an uncertain world, permanence in a temporary existence, and meaning in a universe that appeared indifferent to their needs. Rather than raging against these impossible conditions, Bukowski learned to appreciate the dark humour of the situation. It was funny that conscious beings capable of imagining perfection had been placed in circumstances that guaranteed they would never achieve it. This cosmic mismatch between human aspirations and cosmic reality was the ultimate joke, and learning to laugh at it was a form of enlightenment. Bukowski's humour also served as a way of deflating the pompousness and self-importance that he saw as one of humanity's most tiresome characteristics. People took themselves incredibly seriously while doing things that were objectively ridiculous, like competing for meaningless status symbols or maintaining elaborate social pretenses. His comedy punctured these inflated egos and reminded everyone that underneath all the posturing and performance, we were all just animals trying to figure out how to survive and reproduce. This deflation wasn't meant to be cruel, but liberating, freeing people from the exhausting burden of maintaining false dignity. The writer understood that humour could make unbearable truths palatable and shareable. Direct confrontation with life's harshest realities often provoked denial or despair, but the same truths presented with humour could be accepted and even appreciated. Laughter created a psychological distance that allowed people to examine difficult subjects without being overwhelmed by them. This made comedy a more effective teacher than tragedy because it engaged people's defences less and allowed new perspectives to slip past their usual resistance to uncomfortable information. Bukowski could say things through humour that would have been rejected if presented seriously. His humour was also deeply democratic, finding comedy in high and low culture alike. Intellectuals and street people, artists and factory workers, lovers and enemies all provided material for his amusement because they all displayed the same fundamental human contradictions and delusions. This democratic approach to comedy reflected his belief that human nature was consistent across class and cultural lines. The specific details might vary, but the underlying patterns of self-deception, desperate need, and comic incompetence were universal. This made his humour accessible to readers from all backgrounds, while avoiding the superiority and exclusion that often characterized more sophisticated forms of wit. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski's comedy provided evidence that it was possible to find joy even in the midst of genuine suffering. Laughter didn't solve problems or eliminate pain, but it proved that the human spirit could transcend its circumstances through the simple act of recognition and appreciation. If you could laugh at your situation, you weren't completely defeated by it. This made humour a form of resistance against despair and a demonstration that consciousness itself was valuable regardless of external circumstances. The ability to find the cosmic joke funny was perhaps the most human response possible to an existence that often seemed designed to break the human spirit. Part 15. Freedom versus Security, the Great Trade-off. Throughout his life, Bukowski faced the fundamental choice that confronts everyone but that most people prefer not to examine too closely: the trade-off between freedom and security. At almost every crucial decision point he chose freedom over safety, authenticity over comfort, and independence over belonging. This pattern of choices shaped not only his external circumstances, but his entire philosophy about what made life worth living and what prices were too high to pay for conventional success and acceptance. The clearest example of this trade-off came when Bukowski finally achieved some financial success through his writing in his 50s. He could have used this success to establish a more secure and respectable lifestyle, investing in property, developing ongoing relationships with publishers and editors, and building the kind of literary reputation that would ensure continued income. Instead, he continued to live simply, avoided most professional obligations, and refused to modify his writing to suit market expectations or critical preferences. He understood that the security that came from playing the literary game would require him to sacrifice the very authenticity that had made his work valuable in the first place. Bukowski observed that most people made the opposite choice, trading their freedom and authenticity for the promise of security and social acceptance. They took jobs they didn't believe in, entered relationships that felt dead, and adopted lifestyles that reflected other people's values rather than their own. This trade-off seemed reasonable to them because security felt more important than freedom when you were worried about survival or social rejection. But Bukowski noticed that the security people gained through these compromises was often illusory anyway. Jobs disappeared, marriages failed, and social status proved temporary, leaving people with neither freedom nor security, but only the memory of what they had given up. The writer understood that choosing freedom required accepting a different kind of risk than choosing security. When you prioritized independence and authenticity, you risked poverty, loneliness, and social rejection. When you prioritized security and acceptance, you risked losing touch with yourself and ending up with a life that felt empty and meaningless, even if it was externally successful. Both paths involved real dangers, but Bukowski believed that the risks of freedom were more honest and ultimately more bearable than the risks of security. He would rather be broke and genuine than wealthy and false, because he understood that internal integrity was the foundation of any satisfaction that life could provide. This philosophy extended to his relationships as well as his career choices. Bukowski consistently chose partners and friendships based on genuine compatibility and affection, rather than social advantage or emotional security. He was willing to end relationships that had become comfortable but inauthentic, even when doing so left him isolated and lonely. He preferred the uncertainty of being alone to the false comfort of relationships that required him to pretend to be someone he wasn't. This wasn't because he didn't value human connection, but because he understood that real intimacy was only possible between people who were willing to show up as themselves rather than as carefully constructed personas designed to avoid conflict or rejection. Bukowski also rejected the security that came from belonging to groups, movements or communities that would have welcomed him if he had been willing to conform to their expectations. He could have found acceptance among political radicals, literary bohemians or working-class activists by adopting their ideologies and supporting their causes. But group membership always seemed to require surrendering some portion of his independent judgment and authentic response to experience. He preferred the loneliness of thinking for himself to the comfort of having his opinions provided by others, even when those others shared many of his values and concerns. Intellectual freedom was too precious to trade for social belonging. The writer understood that freedom and security existed in tension not just in external choices, but within individual psychology. The parts of yourself that sought safety and approval often conflicted with the parts that demanded authenticity and independence. Most people resolved this internal conflict by suppressing one side or the other, either becoming rebels who rejected all social conventions or conformists who abandoned all personal desires. Bukowski tried to honor both needs without letting either completely dominate, which required constant attention to the balance between self-expression and social responsibility. This internal negotiation never ended but became more skillful with experience and self-knowledge. Bukowski's choice of freedom over security also reflected his understanding of what death would eventually make irrelevant. When your life was over, no one would care how much money you had accumulated, what position you had achieved, or how well you had maintained your reputation. But the experiences of authentic living, genuine feeling, and honest expression would remain meaningful right up until the end. From the perspective of mortality, security revealed itself as largely illusory, while freedom remained valuable as long as consciousness persisted. This made the choice between them easier, because it clarified which values would stand the test of time, and which were simply culturally conditioned fears and desires. The writer also recognized that his choice of freedom was made easier by his relative lack of responsibility for other people. Parents, caretakers, and others with dependents often couldn't afford to prioritize their own authenticity over the security that their responsibilities required. Bukowski's childless lifestyle and minimal financial obligations gave him luxuries of choice that weren't available to everyone. But he also observed that many people used their responsibilities as excuses for compromises they would have made anyway, out of fear or laziness. The key was being honest about when security was genuinely necessary and when it was simply an excuse for avoiding the risks that authentic living always required. Real freedom meant taking responsibility for the choices you made, rather than pretending they were forced on you by circumstances beyond your control. Part 16. The Nature of Genius and Creative Flow. Bukowski had a complex relationship with the concept of genius that evolved throughout his career, from bitter resentment of those who achieved recognition to hard-won understanding of what creativity actually required and how it could be sustained over decades. His insights into the creative process came not from studying other artists, but from his own daily practice of writing and his observation of what helped or hindered his ability to produce authentic work. This practical approach to understanding creativity gave him perspectives that were often more useful than theoretical discussions of artistic inspiration. Early in his career, Bukowski was tortured by the gap between his own lack of recognition and the success of writers he considered inferior. He couldn't understand why mediocre work got published and praised, while his own honest and powerful writing was consistently rejected. This led him to develop theories about genius being unrecognized and authentic artists being persecuted by corrupt institutions. While there was some truth to these ideas, they also served as protective explanations that allowed him to maintain his self-esteem during years of failure and rejection. The genius theory helped him persevere when external evidence suggested that his writing wasn't valuable or wanted. As Bukowski matured and achieved recognition, his understanding of creativity became more nuanced and practical. He realized that whatever talent he possessed was less important than his willingness to show up consistently and do the work of writing, regardless of whether he felt inspired. Genius, if it existed at all, was more about persistence and honesty than about sudden flashes of brilliant insight. The writers who produced lasting work were those who continued writing through periods of doubt, criticism and apparent failure, rather than those who waited for perfect conditions or divine inspiration. This disciplined approach to creativity was something that could be learned and developed, rather than a mysterious gift that some people possessed and others lacked. Bukowski discovered that his best work came when he got out of his own way and allowed his natural voice to emerge without interference from his conscious mind. This required a kind of relaxed attention that was different from both lazy passivity and forced effort. He learned to trust his intuitive responses to experience and to write what felt true rather than what seemed clever or impressive. This authenticity was more valuable than technical sophistication because it connected directly with readers' own experiences and emotions. The most powerful writing often came from simply describing what was actually happening in his life and mind without trying to make it prettier or more meaningful than it was. The writer also understood that creativity required protecting certain psychological states and avoiding influences that could disrupt the delicate conditions necessary for authentic expression. Social interaction, critical feedback, and commercial pressures all had the potential to interfere with his ability to access his deepest thoughts and feelings. This wasn't because these influences were inherently bad, but because they introduced considerations that could divert attention from the internal process that generated genuine writing. Maintaining creative flow required a kind of selective ignorance about external expectations and judgments that allowed the work to develop according to its own internal logic. Bukowski rejected romantic notions about tortured artists and suffering as necessary for great art. While his own difficult experiences had provided material for his writing, he understood that deliberately seeking suffering was neither necessary nor helpful for creativity. What mattered was honest engagement with whatever experiences life provided, whether pleasant or unpleasant. The key was developing the ability to observe and describe your own experience accurately, rather than trying to force it into predetermined categories of meaning or significance. This observational capacity could be cultivated regardless of whether your life was dramatic or ordinary, painful or comfortable. The writer's understanding of genius also included recognition that individual talent existed within larger cultural and historical contexts that shaped what was possible or valued at any given time. Some genuinely gifted people never achieved recognition because they were born at the wrong time or in the wrong place for their particular gifts to be appreciated. Others achieved fame and success through luck, timing or marketability rather than superior ability. This awareness helped him maintain perspective about both success and failure, understanding that external recognition was an imperfect measure of actual worth or accomplishment. What mattered was the intrinsic value of the work itself, rather than how it was received by critics or the public. Bukowski also learned that creativity was not a separate activity, but a way of approaching all experience with attention and openness. The same qualities that made someone a good writer, honesty, observation, willingness to feel deeply, also made them more alive and present in their daily life. Conversely, habits that deaden creative ability, like emotional numbness, intellectual dishonesty, or obsession with external approval, also diminished the quality of lived experience. This meant that developing as an artist was inseparable from developing as a human being, and both required the same fundamental commitment to truth and authenticity. The creative life was ultimately just life lived with greater awareness and less self-deception. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski discovered that the highest form of creative genius was not the ability to produce masterpieces, but the capacity to remain authentic and honest regardless of external circumstances. True creative success meant continuing to grow and express yourself truthfully, even when you achieved recognition, wealth, or critical acclaim. Many artists were corrupted by success, changing their work to satisfy market demands or critical expectations rather than following their own evolving vision. The greatest creative challenge was maintaining integrity throughout all the changes that a long life inevitably brought, never stopping the process of honest self-examination and expression that had made the work valuable in the first place. Part 17. Politics, Power, and the Corruption of Good Intentions. Bukowski's political philosophy, if it could be called that, was born from deep suspicion of all organized power and institutional authority, rather than from adherence to any particular ideology or party. He had observed firsthand how political movements and social institutions, regardless of their stated goals or good intentions, inevitably became corrupted by the dynamics of power and self-interest. This led him to a kind of anarchistic individualism that rejected most collective solutions to social problems while maintaining genuine concern for human suffering and injustice. The writer's political awakening came not from reading theory, but from working alongside people who had been ground down by economic and social systems that claimed to serve their interests. At the post office he watched intelligent and capable workers being treated like machines by supervisors who had been promoted not for their competence, but for their willingness to enforce inhumane policies. The gap between official rhetoric about postal service serving the public and the reality of workers being abused for the sake of efficiency taught him that institutions reliably protected their own interests at the expense of both their employees and their supposed beneficiaries. Bukowski was particularly skeptical of political movements that claimed to represent the working class or the poor. He observed that most of these movements were led by middle-class intellectuals who had little direct experience of the conditions they claimed to want to change. Their solutions often reflected theoretical understanding rather than practical knowledge of what life was actually like for people struggling to survive. More importantly, these leaders seemed more interested in gaining power for themselves than in actually improving conditions for the people they claimed to serve. The rhetoric of revolution and reform became another form of career advancement for ambitious individuals who used other people's suffering as stepping stones to their own success. The writer also noticed how political involvement tended to corrupt even well-intentioned people by requiring them to compromise their values for strategic reasons. To build coalitions and win elections, politicians had to make promises they couldn't keep and alliances with people they didn't trust. They had to simplify complex issues into slogans that could fit on bumper stickers and speak in platitudes that would offend the fewest possible voters. Over time, this constant compromise and performance eroded their ability to think clearly or speak honestly about the problems they had originally wanted to solve. The political process turned sincere reformers into the same kind of manipulative careerists they had initially opposed. Bukowski's rejection of organized politics didn't mean he was indifferent to social justice or unaware of systemic problems. He wrote extensively about poverty, workplace exploitation, racism, and other forms of institutional oppression based on his own experience and observation. But he believed that these problems were symptoms of deeper issues about human nature and the dynamics of power that couldn't be solved through political action alone. Changing laws or redistributing wealth might provide temporary relief for some people, but it wouldn't address the fundamental tendencies toward domination, greed, and self-deception that created injustice in the first place. Real change would have to come from individual transformation rather than collective action. The writer was also skeptical of the idea that social problems could be solved through rational planning and expert management. He had seen too many well-designed programs fail because they ignored the complexity of human motivation and the unintended consequences of institutional intervention. Social engineers, like political leaders, tended to overestimate their ability to predict and control human behavior while underestimating the ways their interventions might backfire or create new problems. The road to hell, as the saying went, was paved with good intentions, and Bukowski had walked far enough down that road to be wary of anyone who claimed to know how to fix society's problems. This didn't make him a conservative who wanted to preserve existing arrangements, but rather a pessimist who doubted that any arrangements could eliminate the fundamental sources of human misery. He observed that every generation believed it could solve problems that had plagued humanity throughout history, and every generation eventually discovered that their solutions created new problems that were sometimes worse than the original ones. This historical perspective made him suspicious of revolutionary rhetoric and reformist enthusiasm, while increasing his appreciation for small improvements and individual acts of kindness. Maybe you couldn't change the world, but you could treat the people in your immediate vicinity with decency and honesty. Bukowski's political philosophy ultimately centered on the belief that the most subversive thing anyone could do was to live authentically and refuse to be corrupted by the systems of power and conformity that surrounded them. By maintaining his integrity, speaking honestly about his experience, and refusing to play the games that society rewarded, he provided an example of resistance that was more powerful than any organized opposition. This individual resistance didn't require leaders, manifestos, or mass movements that could be co-opted or corrupted. It only required the courage to be yourself in a world that constantly pressured you to be something else. This form of politics was available to everyone regardless of their education, resources, or social position, which made it more democratic than any political movement that required special knowledge or organizational skills. The writer understood that this individualistic approach to social change had serious limitations and couldn't address large-scale problems that required collective action. But he also believed that without individuals who were committed to honesty and authenticity, collective action would inevitably be corrupted by the same forces that had corrupted previous reform efforts. The foundation of any just society had to be people who were willing to tell the truth and resist corruption in their own lives. Until enough individuals developed this capacity for integrity, political solutions would remain superficial changes that left the deeper problems untouched. Part 18. Alcohol, Consciousness and the Chemistry of Truth. Bukowski's relationship with alcohol was complex and evolved throughout his life, from desperate self-medication to conscious tool for altering perception, and eventually to something approaching wisdom about the role that altered consciousness could play in accessing authentic experience. His drinking was neither simply destructive addiction nor romantic bohemian indulgence, but a complicated negotiation with the chemical modification of awareness that taught him important lessons about consciousness, creativity, and the nature of ordinary reality. Understanding this relationship is crucial to understanding both his philosophy and his approach to living authentically in a world that often seemed designed to prevent genuine experience. In his early years, Bukowski drank primarily to escape the pain of social rejection, family abuse, and economic uncertainty. Alcohol provided temporary relief from anxiety, self-consciousness, and the overwhelming sense of not fitting into the world around him. This medicinal use of drinking was common among people who had been damaged by their circumstances and lacked other means of managing psychological pain. But Bukowski gradually discovered that alcohol could do more than simply numb difficult feelings. It could also remove psychological barriers that prevented him from accessing deeper levels of honesty and creativity. The writer found that moderate amounts of alcohol could dissolve the internal censorship that normally filtered his thoughts and feelings before they reached consciousness or expression. The social conditioning, self-doubt and fear of judgment that usually shaped his responses to experience became temporarily less powerful, allowing more authentic reactions to emerge. This wasn't because alcohol made him more creative, but because it reduced the psychological interference that blocked access to thoughts and feelings that were already present. In this sense, drinking became a tool for self-discovery rather than self-destruction, though the line between useful and harmful consumption was always thin and dangerous. Bukowski also used alcohol as a way of experimenting with different states of consciousness and observing how altered perception affected his understanding of reality. He noticed that problems that seemed overwhelming when he was sober often appeared manageable or even amusing when he was drunk. Conversely, insights that felt profound while drinking sometimes revealed themselves as shallow or obvious when examined with a clear mind. This experimental approach taught him that consciousness was more flexible and context-dependent than most people realized, and that what seemed like absolute truth in one state of mind might be merely one perspective among many possible ones. This relativity of perception became an important part of his philosophical understanding. The writer was also aware of alcohol's social functions and how it could reveal truths about human nature that were normally hidden by polite conventions. When people drank together, their usual masks and pretenses often fell away, allowing more genuine personalities to emerge. This could be ugly and embarrassing, but it was also illuminating because it showed what people were really like underneath their social performances. Bukowski used these observations to develop his understanding of human psychology and to write more accurately about the contradictions and hidden motivations that drove people's behavior. Alcohol became a kind of truth serum that revealed character in ways that ordinary social interaction rarely did. But Bukowski was never naive about the costs and dangers of heavy drinking. He watched alcohol destroy people he loved, including Jane Cooney Baker, and he experienced its negative effects on his own health, relationships, and productivity. He understood that the insights and creative inspiration that sometimes came with drinking were often purchased at the price of physical deterioration and emotional instability. The challenge was learning to use alcohol consciously and deliberately rather than being used by it, maintaining enough control to benefit from its consciousness-altering effects without becoming enslaved to them. This required a kind of ongoing negotiation with addiction that was never fully resolved. As Bukowski aged and his drinking began to take a more serious toll on his health, he gradually modified his relationship with alcohol without completely abandoning it. He learned to drink more strategically, using it when he needed to access certain states of mind for writing or social interaction while maintaining periods of sobriety for health and clarity. This mature approach to altered consciousness reflected his understanding that different states of mind were useful for different purposes, and that the goal was not to achieve any particular state permanently, but to have access to a range of perspectives and experiences. Flexibility of consciousness was more valuable than any single way of being, whether sober or intoxicated. The writer's exploration of alcohol also led him to insights about the nature of ordinary consciousness and why so many people felt compelled to alter it through various means. He observed that unmodified awareness often felt constrained by social expectations, personal fears, and mental habits that prevented people from experiencing life fully. The appeal of alcohol, drugs, and other consciousness-altering practices wasn't necessarily escapism, but a legitimate desire to access broader ranges of experience and perception. The problem was that most people lacked the knowledge and discipline to explore altered states safely and beneficially, leading them to become dependent on substances that ultimately limited rather than expanded their awareness. Bukowski's philosophy of consciousness ultimately emphasized the importance of maintaining awareness and choice, regardless of what state of mind you were in. Whether drunk or sober, the key was to remain observant and honest about what you were experiencing and why you were experiencing it. This conscious approach to altered consciousness could provide valuable insights and experiences that were unavailable to ordinary awareness, but it required treating substances as tools rather than escapes and maintaining enough self-knowledge to recognize when the costs outweighed the benefits. The goal was not to achieve any particular state of consciousness, but to develop the flexibility and wisdom to navigate different states skillfully and authentically. Part 19. Legacy and what remains after the game ends. In his later years, Bukowski began to contemplate what, if anything, would remain of his life and work after his death, though he approached this question with characteristic skepticism about the importance of posthumous reputation and literary immortality. His thoughts on legacy were shaped by his observation that most people's concern with how they would be remembered was really disguised fear of mortality and desperate need for significance that couldn't be satisfied by any amount of fame or recognition. Rather than seeking immortality through his work, he focused on living authentically in the present and letting others worry about what would survive him. Bukowski understood that the desire for lasting legacy often corrupted the very work it was meant to preserve. Writers who became too concerned with their place in literary history started writing for critics and scholars rather than for living readers, producing work that was impressive but lifeless. They censored their authentic voices in favor of what seemed more likely to endure, not realizing that only genuine expression had any chance of remaining vital across generations. The most enduring works were usually those created without regard for their lasting impact, by artists who were simply trying to capture their experience honestly rather than create monuments to themselves. The writer also observed how posthumous reputation was largely beyond the control of the person being remembered. Critics, scholars, and cultural gatekeepers inevitably interpreted and reinterpreted artistic work according to their own agendas and the concerns of their historical moment. The Bukowski that future generations knew might bear little resemblance to the actual person who had lived and written, just as contemporary understanding of past writers often said more about present concerns than about historical reality. This made the pursuit of particular kinds of recognition futile, because you couldn't control how you would be understood or misunderstood by people who never knew you personally. The only honest approach was to create the most authentic work possible and let time sort out what was valuable and what wasn't. Bukowski found more meaning in the immediate impact his work had on living readers than in speculation about its future reputation. He received thousands of letters from people who told him that his books had helped them feel less alone, given them permission to be honest about their struggles, or simply provided companionship during difficult times. This direct connection with readers who were actually alive and struggling with the same problems he had faced felt more real and valuable than any critical acclaim or scholarly attention. If his work could provide comfort or insight to people who needed it, that was sufficient legacy regardless of whether future generations remembered his name. The writer's approach to legacy was also influenced by his understanding of mortality and the ultimate impermanence of all human achievements. No matter how famous or influential someone became, they would eventually be forgotten as completely as if they had never existed. Civilizations rose and fell, languages disappeared, and even the greatest works of art eventually crumbled or were lost. From this cosmic perspective, the difference between fame and obscurity was negligible because both led to the same final destination of complete obliteration. This awareness freed him from anxiety about his reputation and allowed him to focus on the intrinsic value of the work itself rather than its potential for survival. But Bukowski also recognized that while individual legacies were temporary, the human experiences he wrote about were universal and timeless. As long as people struggled with loneliness, worked at jobs they hated, fell in and out of love, and faced their own mortality, his observations about these experiences would remain relevant. The specific details of his life and time would eventually become historical curiosities, but the emotions and insights he captured might continue to resonate with readers facing similar challenges. This kind of legacy wasn't about personal immortality, but about contributing to the ongoing human conversation about what it means to be alive and conscious in a difficult world. The writer's thoughts on legacy also included recognition that his influence might be most powerful in ways he couldn't predict or control. Other writers who read his work might be inspired to write more honestly about their own experiences, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond his direct literary output. Readers might carry his insights into their own lives and relationships, treating others with more honesty and compassion because of what they had learned from his example. These indirect influences were impossible to measure, but potentially more important than any formal literary recognition because they affected how people actually lived, rather than just how they thought about literature. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski understood that the most meaningful legacy anyone could leave was the example of having lived authentically and honestly, regardless of external circumstances. In a world full of pretense, compromise and performance, simply being yourself and telling the truth about your experience was a form of resistance that could inspire others to do the same. This kind of influence couldn't be planned or manufactured, but emerged naturally from the choice to value integrity over success and authenticity over approval. If his life demonstrated that it was possible to remain true to yourself even when the costs were high, that might be the most valuable thing he could pass on to future generations. The ultimate legacy was not what you created, but how you lived, and how that example might give others permission to live more courageously and honestly themselves. Part 20. Living with Contradictions, the Final Wisdom. In the end, perhaps the most profound aspect of Bukowski's philosophy was his acceptance of contradiction as an essential part of both human nature and authentic living. Rather than trying to resolve the tensions between his various beliefs and impulses, he learned to embrace paradox as the natural state of any consciousness complex enough to see multiple sides of difficult questions. This acceptance of contradiction freed him from the exhausting effort to maintain consistency and allowed him to respond authentically to whatever life presented without forcing his reactions to fit predetermined categories of meaning or value. Bukowski understood that he was simultaneously cruel and tender, cynical and hopeful, selfish and generous, wise and foolish, often within the same day or even the same conversation. Rather than trying to eliminate these contradictions or favour one side over the other, he accepted them as evidence of his full humanity. This psychological flexibility allowed him to respond appropriately to different situations rather than being locked into fixed patterns of behaviour based on a rigid self-image. He could be tough when toughness was needed and gentle when gentleness was called for, without worrying about whether these responses were consistent with some abstract idea of who he was supposed to be. This acceptance of contradiction extended to his philosophical positions as well. He could simultaneously believe that life was meaningless and beautiful, that love was both essential and destructive, that success was worthless and worth pursuing, that people were fundamentally selfish and capable of genuine generosity. These weren't logical inconsistencies to be resolved, but accurate observations about the complexity of existence that couldn't be captured by any single perspective or simple formula. Reality itself was contradictory, and any philosophy that tried to eliminate paradox was probably too simplistic to be useful for navigating actual experience. Bukowski's comfort with contradiction also allowed him to change his mind and evolve his positions based on new experience without feeling that he was betraying his earlier beliefs. He could acknowledge that ideas that had once seemed true no longer fit his understanding without having to defend or justify his previous positions. This intellectual flexibility kept his thinking alive and dynamic rather than calcified and defensive. He was more interested in accuracy than consistency, more committed to describing what he actually experienced than to maintaining a coherent philosophical system that might not match the complexity of real life. This willingness to be wrong and to change course when necessary was perhaps his greatest intellectual strength. The writer also understood that different contradictory truths could be appropriate for different circumstances or stages of life. What served him well in his youth might become limiting in middle age, and insights that helped him survive poverty might not apply when he achieved financial security. Rather than trying to find universal principles that would work in all situations, he developed a more contextual approach to wisdom that recognized that the right response often depended on specific circumstances and timing. This pragmatic flexibility made him more effective at handling the changes and challenges that a long life inevitably brought. Bukowski's acceptance of contradiction also made him more tolerant of other people's apparent inconsistencies and failures. He understood that everyone was struggling to balance competing needs, desires, and obligations that couldn't always be reconciled perfectly. This made him less judgmental about others' choices and more sympathetic to the difficulties of living with integrity in a complex world. He could appreciate people's good intentions even when their actions fell short, and forgive failures that stemmed from human limitation rather than malice. This compassion for contradiction made his relationships deeper and more authentic, because people felt accepted for who they actually were, rather than judged for who they weren't. The philosophical acceptance of contradiction also helped Bukowski maintain his sanity and sense of humour in the face of life's fundamental absurdities. Instead of being frustrated by the gap between how things should work and how they actually worked, he learned to find this gap amusing and even charming. The fact that conscious beings capable of imagining perfection were stuck in imperfect circumstances was funny rather than tragic once you accepted that contradiction was the rule rather than the exception. This cosmic sense of humour about paradox made life more bearable and even enjoyable despite its obvious limitations and frustrations. Perhaps most importantly, Bukowski's embrace of contradiction taught him that authenticity didn't require perfection or complete self-understanding, but simply the willingness to acknowledge and express whatever was actually happening in your experience. You didn't have to resolve all your internal conflicts or eliminate all your flaws to live honestly. You just had to stop pretending that you were simpler or better than you actually were. This radical acceptance of your complete self, including all its contradictions and imperfections, was the foundation of the authentic life that Bukowski spent decades learning to live. In the end, the wisdom was not in solving the paradoxes of existence, but in learning to dance with them gracefully, finding beauty and meaning in the very complexity that made simple answers impossible. This was perhaps his final gift to anyone willing to listen, the permission to be fully human, with all the contradictions that humanity entailed. Charles Bukowski never claimed to have answers to life's deepest questions. Instead, he offered something more valuable: the example of someone who had faced existence honestly, without illusions or comfortable lies, and found ways to keep living and even laughing despite everything he had discovered about the human condition. His philosophy was not a system to be adopted, but an invitation to develop your own authentic relationship with reality, whatever that might look like. In a world full of people trying to sell you solutions, Bukowski offered only his experience and the hard-won wisdom that came from refusing to look away from truth, however uncomfortable it might be. Perhaps that's the most anyone can offer another person: the courage to see clearly, and the companionship of knowing that others have seen the same difficult truths and somehow found ways to continue the strange and beautiful journey of being human.